We are live. So, welcome everybody. I'm very excited today about today's talk. Today with us, we have Lisa Mallner. She is um, she's joining us from Europe, and she is an AI investment manager at Copenhagen Capacity. She has a lot of expertise about Nordics and especially Nordic startup ecosystem, including trends, key initiatives, insights into how to enter the market and actually get successful in there. About Lisa, I'll give you a few words, and Lisa will give a better introduction, a wide introduction about herself. But what really important, I think, for you guys to know that Lisa is an AI investment manager at Copenhagen Capacity and focuses on supporting business development for high-tech companies. She's also project manager at Nordics.AI, a nonprofit that supports AI and machine learning ecosystem in the Nordics, and is an active in Nordic startup ecosystem as a chapter organization of WomenTechmakers Copenhagen and AI Copenhagen meetup group. So, Lisa, welcome to Go Global World webinar. I'm really excited. Let us know where you're based right now and give us some introduction about yourself, and let's get to the topic.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you for that nice intro. I thought I'd be doing everything, but now I can't introduce myself because you said everything. But my name is Lisa. As you can tell by my accent, I'm actually not originally from the Nordics. I'm originally from the US. I've been living in the Nordics for as part of the Nordic startup ecosystem for around 8 years. But I think that gives me a unique perspective because I can be telling you a little bit about this from an outsider's perspective, which is really important when you're considering if you'd like to develop a business here. Just to add to a little bit about what you said, I got into this ecosystem via my studies when I studied international business and began working for some startups. But currently I work with helping all sorts of high-tech companies, both startups and SMEs from all over the world to land in this region. And I'm actually calling in right now from the Arctic Circle from Tromsø, so it's quite dark. But I really can't get more Nordic than that. And I also have to apologize if my Wi-Fi is not amazing. I think it will hold up for this talk, but let's see. But let's get to it. I don't see why I need to spend more time on myself because you're not here to learn about me, but to learn about the Nordics. So let me just share my stream. And I hope this is working. Can you tell me, Danil, if it's okay?
Yes, it is working.
Great. So I'm going to give a talk today that's basically an intro to the Nordic startup ecosystem. And I say here come the Vikings, but of course the Nordics includes more than just Scandinavia. Actually, under my definition, I also include Estonia, which considers themselves new Nordics. But the traditional interaction of what the Nordic countries are, or definition, excuse me, of what the countries are is, of course, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. So let's just get to it. But before we begin, first a little, maybe not an advertisement, but just a quick overview for why I'm here and what I can help you with after this time if you need help. So Copenhagen Capacity is the inward investment agency for Greater Copenhagen, the capital region here in Denmark. And what that means is if your company is considering to move over here, we can help you with everything that you need, all the way from the initial business consideration up until you're planning to land and attract talent and maybe expand. And that is completely free of charge and completely confidential. So if you are considering the region, it doesn't hurt to reach out. It's free to talk to us. This is not a sales pitch. This is just what we do. And if we think you're a good fit and if I can help you make success here, then of course that makes me happy and hopefully that makes you happy. So I'll put my contact at the end and you're very free to reach out. But just to get started, the Nordics are, well, if you don't know what the Nordics are, I'm not really sure why you're on this talk. But just in case, we're a region in Europe with about 26 million people, so it's not very large, especially from my perspective coming from the US. The Sweden is by far the most populated, but of course, all of the countries are actually quite small. The main cities you probably know already, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Oslo, Helsinki, and Reykjavik are the capital cities and also the largest cities in each country. And these are very, very old countries. I know Copenhagen, the history of the city is going back to the 1500s and, hundreds of years of history and 5 kings, and it's still a monarchy. But regardless, they are actually the most developed economies in the world. You probably know the Nordic countries from some of their big flagship companies. You might know Nokia from Finland. You might know Lego from Denmark, or Novo Nordisk. But of course, you might even know Saab from Sweden. But we're talking about startups today, and it's just to explain what the base and the background is. The other thing the Nordics are famous for is, of course, the Nordic welfare state, the Nordic welfare systems. And that's a very unique condition compared to the rest of the world. And what that means is that there's a certain type of community basis from which you can build a company here that's quite transparent and interesting in comparison to many other regions. So first of all, there's a very, very high level of trust. That's kind of the foundation of what makes the welfare state strong. And what that means is that there's a lot less friction when you do business, because people kind of already trust each other when they start speaking with you. Of course, the downside of that would be that if people don't know you, they don't trust you. So warm introductions in the Nordics are very, very important. And that's why we almost always recommend that if you are starting a business here, it's really important to try to meet partners on the ground, because it's important to try to build trust locally if you want to kind of get into this strong community base that helps you grow your company. Another interesting aspect of the welfare state is that there's a lot of investment in education. So if you don't know, students here actually get a stipend when they go to school. It's not like the US where you go into thousands and thousands of dollars in debt. And that means that the populations are very, very highly educated. And with the highly educated population, you have people that are more open to new technologies. They're also more open to building new technologies, and they're kind of first movers on many things. The other thing the Nordics are really famous for, people say they're the happiest countries, and I think the reason for that is that the work-life balance is very good. The Nordics actually work the least of any region on Earth, but they do not work inefficiently. They actually work quite efficiently, but people will not spend time pretending to work. There's a lot of trust, so that means that if you say, I'm finished with work, I want to go home, then your boss will trust that you finished your work and you can go home. So that's a kind of unique condition that makes people really want to stay and build a business here, because they feel that they have a good balance between their work and their life. And finally, of course, the ecosystem is very community oriented. It's very much 1 degree apart, 2 degrees of separation from everybody. So once you're in that network, you can really, really get deep ties and business connections that might take longer in other regions. But of course, you have to first breach that initial barrier of trying to build local trust. I'm just going to dive into a couple of things that make the Nordics stand out from other regions. I did mention the unique welfare state conditions, but one of the externalities of this is that it's a region that is very good at attracting global talent, because a lot of people come and think, oh, I want to work in the happiest country. I'd like to get a good work-life balance and, make my commute a 15-minute bike commute and be part of this Nordic welfare model and not worry about losing my job. So the Nordics are really, really good at attracting and retaining global talent. Another reason for this is that they are all English speaking as a second language. So you don't have to learn a Nordic language to come here. You can simply come and only speak English, and you will be able to develop a career. So that's kind of a unique condition. And that means that a lot of talent, especially at the master's and PhD levels, where it's easier to get visas, comes and stays. This is something that's relevant for businesses. It doesn't seem that it's relevant from first glance, but it is. And that is that it's the best for digital governance. So the top digital governance countries are all in the Nordics. Of course, Estonia and Denmark are usually tied around number 1. What this means is that everything that you have to do in relation to your business, from taxes and registration to accounting, et cetera, can be done totally online. You don't need to do anything in person. You don't need anything with stamps. And that means that if your team is distributed, or if you're, the head of your company is not currently living in the country, you can get everything finished remotely. And that's something that makes it very, very frictionless and easy to do business. I think in Denmark, we've been able to set up businesses in around 11 minutes fully online. So that's kind of a unique condition that makes it easy when you're starting a startup. And then I will also highlight a little bit that the Nordics rank very highly on innovation. It's obviously a result of the highly educated populations, with a lot of people having masters and PhDs. They are really getting into deep tech research, especially in some of these sectors the Nordics are strong in, for example, robotics, healthcare, bioinnovation. artificial intelligence, etc., the Nordics are all ranking very, very highly. And then finally, I'll say that they're very, very high on transparency. This also is a feature of a high trust country. So that means corruption is low. Of course, sometimes countries can get burned. There's been some scandals in relation to corruption, but overall it means that when you do business, you don't have to worry about that there's some sort of opaque red tape or you can't figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy. In general, you'll find it's a very high level of transparency, and what you see is what you get. And if you read the rules, then that's pretty straightforward. So that means that in general, it's a little bit easier to do business. The other really good result of this transparency and this trust is that there's a lot of data. So when there is a high level of trust in the government and high level of transparency, that means that there's huge historical, very rich repositories of data. And it's extremely important for research, especially for certain types of startups. And it also means that the public sector is highly involved in the gathering of this data and makes sandboxes for, I don't know why there's a little typo on the bottom, but there's access to sandboxes for startups in the Nordics if you're working within certain types of companies related to this data. For example, financial data or health data, or if you're looking to do something with the smart cities and you'd like to get urban data and city data. These are all projects that are relatively easy to get involved in the Nordics. Currently, the big push is, of course, for environmental data and data related to what happens when people interact in cities and how to make it more green. But of course, health data is also huge. I know Finland and Estonia have, I believe, the best global setup for secondary patient data. So it's very good resource for startups that are looking to figure out how to apply data to their services. So now what you actually came for, which is the startup ecosystem. And I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the conditions and some of the things that I think are interesting. So first of all, it is the #1 region in Europe by venture capital investment per capita. However, that's not necessarily coming from local investors. Most of the investment comes from abroad. We do find that when companies are looking to relocate to the Nordics, generally they're not relocating because they're looking to raise a round at the early stages, but because it's the right business conditions to grow the company from. And that means that they can be at home in the Nordics, but raise money from investors that might be based in the US or the UK or Germany or Asia. So there's a lot of international talent, venture capital that's looking at the region because there's kind of this good, trustworthy brand. You don't really see a company like Theranos or Juicera being built from the Nordics. You see companies that are maybe a little bit underpriced, maybe a little bit bad at marketing themselves, but are making really good, solid technology. So a lot of the investment is coming from abroad. The Nordics also have the most unicorns per capita. I'll get more to that later. And I'll also say because they're very small countries, the businesses tend to go global very, very early. If you are a country of 5 million people, it's really not the biggest, most interesting market for a startup if they're looking to, become a unicorn. So generally, companies are looking global from a quite early stage, and that's also helped by having international teams that are speaking English. And finally, I'll get into the main sectors later, but the Nordics are probably best known for green tech, for gaming, for ICT, for health, and for deep tech. As I mentioned, the market size itself is not that large, but there are a lot of startups per capita. This data comes from Dealroom. They've tracked around 13,000 startups since 2000, which is a pretty good amount per capita considering how low the populations are, and 15 billion in venture capital. There's a lot of startup jobs that are based here. So if you're looking to just join the ecosystem as a co-founder or as an early stage employee, there's many possibilities for that. And it's definitely a place where you can find a lot of global talent that's looking to join a Nordic startup at an early stage. I did mention the most unicorns per capita in the world are from the Nordics. That's including Estonia, of course. This is quite an old chart, but there's been a couple of new unicorns in the past few years. The most famous, of course, is probably Spotify, but the majority of the unicorns are actually B2B companies, so they're a little bit less well-known than some of the kind of B2C unicorns that you might hear about in the startup ecosystem. So that would be companies like Tradeshift, for example, that are doing something that's very important in the B2B sector, but maybe isn't something that consumers just know off the bat. I did mention that the VC investment is mostly coming from abroad, and that's because the local VC investment in relation to the startup density is relatively low. So in general, a lot of the investment at the very early stages, the seed and the pre-seed, the public sector tends to be more heavily involved than other regions. There's a lot of startups that are looking at grants from the government at the early stages. The angel investment ecosystems, the level of development also varies by country, but in general, it tends to be more conservative. So the VC investment in comparison to a place like Israel is maybe not exactly the strongest point in the Nordics, but it has been growing and it has not been super negatively affected by COVID. I'm going to go into a couple of the strength sectors because, of course, the Nordics are strong in a couple of things. They're not strong in everything as small countries, but they are globally leading in a few things. I'll start, of course, with health tech, which is in everyone's mind during this pandemic. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of deep historical data in the healthcare sector, but also from biobanks and from personal ID numbers, et cetera, that you can kind of compare and layer to make really interesting types of products and services. And getting access to this data, of course, it depends on what type of data you need and it depends on the country. But in comparison, the setups are relatively straightforward. Generally, they can be done digitally. And you can use that data for a commercial product as long as you're following, of course, European GDPR standards, et cetera. And this has led to kind of a huge trend towards personalized medicine, which I think is European-wide and not just Nordics. So there's a lot of companies that are coming here and looking and seeing, what if I combine the data from the smartwatch with data from the regional hospital, and also with data from the biobank and also with data from the city, and see what kind of extreme personalized insights I can get from that and sell. So that's something that you can do with the kind of data setup that's set up here. Another thing that people might not realize is that there's a lot of life science companies here. For example, Novo Nordisk and Leo Pharma are Nordic companies. There's a cluster of life science companies called Medicon Valley that's based in the Nordics, and it's actually the largest cluster of life science companies outside of Basel and Boston. So maybe a little bit less well-known, but hugely important for the local economies. And a lot of the investments within health tech, of course, are also coming not from VCs, but from the global pharma and biotech sectors that are here that have their own funding mechanisms. And of course, the pipeline of talent that comes from both the incumbents as well as the university programs is very, very high. So in general, you'll find that health tech companies in the Nordics tend to be very strong. Some of the better known companies are also making products that have a strong global use case in terms of maybe addressing SDGs. So one example would be, for example, Natural Cycles in Sweden, which is the only app birth control that's considered acceptable by insurance companies. And considering where some countries have been on women's reproductive rights, I think companies like these are getting a lot of positive attention for the Nordics. Fintech is another sector that has been doing very well in the Nordics. There was kind of a boom a couple years ago. Maybe we're seeing the tail end of it. Maybe it's continuing. But basically, because the population is so digitized and because it's part of the EU open banking infrastructure, and of course, 5G everywhere and all this type of kind of good digital infrastructure and frameworks, this is a place where it's kind of easy to make fintech products that are like mobilely oriented and digital first, et cetera. So this is the region that was the first to go cashless, and it's also the region where the majority of the population, their bank accounts actually use a mobile money service provider. So there has been a lot of maybe not globally scaled companies, but a lot of innovation in the space in regards to fintech consumer products. The other thing is that a lot of the Nordic banks, they cooperate with fintechs and invest in them strategically. So for example, the Copenhagen Fintech Hub, which has around 200 partners with banks all across the Nordics, helps banks to partner with startups and to partner with researchers that are trying to make interesting financial products, especially if they're towards impact, which is a big trend right now. And then there's an interesting cross-border payment system. It's called P27. It's a pan-Nordic project in multiple currencies. And that's also been spurring a lot of innovation in the space. Deep tech is probably the buzzword that everyone's been hearing in the ecosystem globally, of course. I think deep tech is kind of nebulous to define. A lot of investors, they define it differently, but for this purpose of this presentation, I'm defining it as innovations or companies that rely on research that takes many, many years to reach fruition. So something that kind of has a long tail on development, 7 or 10 years, and relies on a super high level of expertise to be created, so PhDs. That can cover a lot of different sectors, but it can be everything from biotech to nanotech to quantum robotics, etc. Because there's so many PhDs and masters here, deep tech has been a space that's been growing, but has been historically underinvested in. But there has been kind of a new wave of deep tech VC, starting with WomenVentures in Finland, that are specifically focused on this play. And more investors are now looking at deep tech and being okay with this kind of less immediate return on investment. So the other thing that's helping fill this space is, of course, there's a lot of global investors interested in deep tech. And because so much of the VC that goes into the Nordics is not actually local, but comes from the global VC ecosystem, they are looking at the Nordic brand and looking at Nordic deep tech companies and helping fill that funding gap. The leading research right now, especially in the Nordics and especially in Denmark, is done in quantum and robotics, where there's massive clusters, and nanotech. But of course, energy and sustainability are huge in the Nordics and in Europe right now. So everything that's related to products that can help make the green transition easier in the deep tech sector are very, very hyped. And of course, AI, it was and still is and remains the most hyped of all the, I guess, what you could consider deep tech or machine learning companies. There's a huge amount of machine learning researchers and machine learning research being done in the Nordics, not necessarily always being commercialized, but the schools are considered top globally. So for example, the DTU, Danish Technical University, was recently ranked just below MIT for certain fields within AI. So even though it's not always commercialized, there's a lot of talent here that the companies rely on when they're building deep tech. However, it is very difficult to commercialize research from universities. One of the weak spots is that often the universities control the IP, and it's not very attractive for a company to become a spin-out. So it's something that is maybe holding the ecosystem back a little bit, but there has been a positive trend towards trying to fix those barriers. I think if you don't know anything about the Nordic startup ecosystem, you might know a little bit about Nordic Gaming. One of the first unicorns in the Nordics was Supercell, but a lot of people might also know King, they might know Unity, they might know IO Interactive. So the gaming industry is by far the most historical and well-developed in the region. And gaming is also something that's really popular culturally. Actually, there's, I believe, in Sweden, it's the only non-Japanese owned Nintendo distributor in the entire world is based there since the 70s. So it's also the place where I believe the first Nintendo fan club was created. So gaming has really been a huge part of the culture. It's something that people do for fun. And there's also a deep, deep talent pool in the universities for game development and for adjacent industries. Mediology departments, and audiovisual, of course, and music production, everything kind of related to gaming is extremely, extremely popular in the Nordics. And esports is actually something that is maybe less globally recognized, but is also significant. You can actually study esports in a few of the universities here. So it's something, excuse me, I'm just gonna take a drink. It's something that, even though it might not be as globally well known as South Korea, is a significant part of the culture. And there's a very well-developed ecosystem around funding and around building new and interesting indie games. And then finally, we'll end with sustainable tech. So every Nordic country has an extremely ambitious sustainability goal. All of them would like to reach carbon neutrality by 2030, which is a huge goal. But that means that there's an incredible amount of public sector support for reaching this goal. And that's everything from carbon neutrality, but also, the circular economy and how we recycle waste and how do we use less energy and, wind energy and everything related to the green transition, essentially. And that means that if you're a startup in this space, there's very, very strong public sector support, and you can get a lot of handholding with your development. And you can also work with the public sector if you'd like to bring your product into society at large. I would also say that sustainable development is kind of something that historically goes very well with the Nordic welfare model, because if you're trying to, make growth in the welfare model, it's much, much better to do it sustainably. That's kind of built into the model itself. And because there's maybe historically been a lot of industries around natural resources here, with, for example, fishing and with forestry, there's kind of a historical understanding about natural resource use. And circular economy has been in the lexicon for much, much longer than it's been in the global lexicon. In general, there's kind of a higher level of environmental awareness. And there's also very stringent environmental requirements on products in comparison to many parts of the world. So the framework and the environment around sustainable tech development is very well developed to kind of grow the companies that are going to help bring us to carbon neutrality and help reach us the SDG goals. Most likely will come from the Nordics. I'm just going to highlight a couple of emerging trends. So this is areas that are kind of up and coming in terms of the number of companies, the number of investments, and the type of research going on in these fields. The first is space tech. I'm in a very relevant space for space tech right now up here in the Arctic Circle because, of course, with the geographic proximity, this is the area where a lot of space research is being done, where a lot of satellite launches and rocket launches are being done. Actually, northern Sweden is the space center of Europe. And even outside of the startup ecosystem, this is an area where there's a lot of research being done in astrophysics and in regards to civilian interaction with the space and space tech economy. For startups, the main focus has been Earth observation startups. So that's basically tying again to the availability of data. But it's startups that are looking at Earth observation data and satellite data and seeing what they can do with that to make a service. And also reusable rockets, which kind of ties into the sustainability tech from the previous slide. Urban tech, again, it's a term that is difficult to define, but for purposes of this, I'll say it covers everything from smart cities to prop tech, but it's basically technologies that rely on urban infrastructure to be successful. Urban tech really, really ties into the idea of sustainable tech and sustainable urbanization, which is kind of a major policy goal and public sector goal towards the green transition. So again, related to sustainability, there's a lot of public support for startups in this space. And there's been a lot of new clusters that have popped up in the last year, specifically for urban tech, smart city, prop tech startups that are trying to have a positive or green impact. Of course, the trend is towards green solutions, but the other trend is towards citizen engagement. So how do we engage people in urban life, and how do we make people good neighbors to each other, and how do they interact well with the public sector, and how do they interact with this government infrastructure? All those trends are kind of convalescing here because there's a good framework of a digital government and a kind of willingness to look at green solutions and a lot of public sector data and public sector support that makes it possible to do this type of startup. There's a lot of interesting projects being done in this space. For example, there was an AI for cities tender that went out that was specifically for startups looking to implement AI at the city level. There's a smart city roadmap the Nordics have all written together, which is basically a roadmap for public sectors to do smart city work. And it kind of helps them understand how to interact with startups. If you don't want to work with the public sector, a lot of the architecture firms also cooperate with startups to find sustainable ways to build. So you might see a company that you might know for more traditional architecture is also partnering with a startup to do, monitoring or to use a different type of concrete that absorbs carbon or something like that. So you'll find that they are looking for startups as a way to become innovative themselves. The biggest challenge in urban tech is, even though there's public sector data available and city level data available, the collecting and structuring of it is right now very messy. So one example is if you're tearing down a building, there's not really a good way to kind of gather information on what materials were in that building, where can they be stored, and can they be upcycled, which is really, really important when you want to have a sustainable building or green build. So there's a lot of interest in this space, and if startups are solving these types of problems, it's definitely a place where you should consider landing. Food tech, it's kind of related to agricultural tech, but I'll stick to food tech in the sense that it's the next step after it leaves the farm. Food tech is something that, again, has kind of been under the radar, even though it's actually number 3 in the world globally in terms of the number of companies. So there's some quite large food tech clusters in the Nordics that are mostly working with food processing, with testing, with packaging, and of course with making the ingredients more sustainable. Sustainability is kind of the red thread through a lot of the startups here. There's a lot of food science programs, historical food science programs that generally had fed some of the incumbents. So some of the very large food companies like Fazer, for example. And there's a trend of many researchers are now joining the startups instead, or partnering with startups and commercializing their research. So that's something that's been going on over the last maybe 5 years or so in regards to the clusters kind of promoting startups and working with startups a bit more. And it's kind of growing in tandem with the artificial intelligence sector. As more AI know-how gets into the food space, there's been some interesting innovations in regards to what they can do when they couple that data with food processing and testing. I'm going to go quickly into some investment trends because, of course, if you're a startup, it's always interesting to know, is this a good location for investment, or what type of investment trends are there, and can my startup get investment here? So number one main trend, of course, is that investment firms are now looking at impact as a funding criteria. Impact, again, can be difficult to define. There's no universal way to define it. But in general, I'd say they're looking towards the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a guideline for what they consider as impact. And if you can find that you're compliant with the SDGs, then that would put you in flight. If you have not considered SDGs at all, you may be asked those questions when you get into a deal flow conversation. So SDG compliance and what's the positive impact of your startup on society, that's extremely important. Here in Norway, where I'm sitting right now, I don't think a VC exists that doesn't have a statement about impact as part of their funding criteria. So it's more than a trend, it's actually becoming ubiquitous. However, even though the SDGs are a huge goal, and one of the SDGs is, of course, equality between men and women, actually a lot of the VC goes to all male teams. The Nordics, in general, are considered very gender equal, but when it comes to VC funding, less than 1% actually goes to female founders. And that doesn't match, of course, the number of female founders in the ecosystem, which is closer to around 20 or 30%, depending on the ecosystem. A little bit more goes to mixed teams. But in general, the VC is actually quite traditional in that sense. The other funding gap is that at the very, very early stage, the pre-seed stage, as I mentioned, the business angel communities can be a bit more traditional. They are, of course, like any business angel community, getting more sophisticated. But at the pre-seed investment stage, you might hear companies complain it's a bit difficult to raise. More famous is the post-Series A round. The large rounds tend to be funded from external investors and not from local investors. You don't see Nordic companies raising, B and C rounds from Nordic investors without a US or UK or Asian investor coming in and making a very, very large round. However, I would say it's not necessarily bad that you can't raise a huge round here. Sometimes it's kind of better to be growing under the radar with good support in the right ecosystem than to get a huge influx of money and maybe not have made the same considerations you would have had you been with a more reasonable round size. In terms of where the investment is currently, besides sustainability and climate tech, as I mentioned earlier, enterprise SaaS, of course, has always been the backbone of the startup ecosystem. Health tech obviously has a huge boost from COVID. And agritech is the sector that's most tied to sustainability, that's been growing the most. The public sector is very involved in startup investments in comparison to a lot of ecosystems. There's a lot of grants and a lot of opportunities to get some public money when you are a startup. However, the trend has been that public investment arms are now kind of looking at startups the same way that a private equity or VC might look at them and asking about what's your ROI and how are you planning to grow, et cetera. And that's not necessarily a positive trend for the ecosystem because public sector tends to be a different type of capital. And they should be maybe filling the gaps that the VCs don't. But at the same time, it shows they're becoming more sophisticated and learning about how to work with startups. So it's kind of a win-lose, I guess. I will also say that the local investors now target new Nordics as their geography. So if they're a Nordic investor, that means that they're also targeting Estonia, and they're sometimes also targeting Lithuania, Vilnius as a startup sector. I do want to talk a little bit more about impact investing because that is really the biggest trend. The Nordics are currently leading in sustainable investing. I mean, not just in terms of their portfolios, but also in the discussion, in the keywords and the trends that the Nordics are looking at for sustainability is kind of where a lot of other investors follow. There's been a Europe-wide trend for this, of course. The European Commission has launched the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation this past March, to kind of promote sustainability in investing. But the Nordics are really the ones that are leading the most in assessing their portfolio companies for impact. However, defining impact is not very standardized. As I mentioned, it can be very nebulous. The objectives of what impact is for the company can vary a lot. Sometimes it's kind of a lot of post hoc reasoning. But in general, they'll expect that your company has thought through what SDGs. Impact, of course, can be a lot of different themes, but climate impact is definitely the most common. If you have not considered the green impact of your startup, you should definitely consider that before you talk to a Nordic investor. The other trend I want to highlight is investments coming in from East Asia. This is actually something I've been working on a lot with my current job. If you're interested in learning more, I would say please check out our website, Nordicasian.vc, where we've been tracking this investment trend. But basically, we've learned that actually this chart is not even up to date. There's, I think, 5 investments we missed in 2021. Is that as foreign investors have looked at the region, there's been a huge trend of investors specifically from Japan that have been looking at the Nordics because they feel that there's a good technology fit, and the problems that Nordic societies are facing are very similar, with things like an aging population that needs a lot of health tech technology, and with trying to have really ambitious sustainability goals. So there's kind of a good possibility for these companies to commercialize in East Asia, and therefore the investment has come, and hopefully the success of the companies will follow. The other thing I want to round off with is that there's been a lot of talk about what impact COVID-19 will have on startup ecosystems in Europe. Of course, it's still going on, so it's difficult to say. This data comes from Dealroom, and as of right now, we can see that there hasn't been a very strong impact on COVID. Deal flow conversations that were happening before COVID still happened and deals still closed. And there were still some very, very large rounds that closed in 2020. So at the moment, I think probably due to the welfare state, which helped make sure companies stayed alive and helped give companies support and assistance to a lot of startups, we didn't see that many startups close during COVID, and we didn't see that many rounds lost. So I would say this was a really, really good region to be in if you were a startup during COVID. And I'll round off maybe on a more negative note with some of the challenges if you're coming to the Nordics. First of all, the Nordics kind of have a difficulty with attracting and retaining talent. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is the #1 region for global talent. That's absolutely true. However, from a Nordic perspective, they actually need more if they'd like to grow the startup ecosystem. And as visa rules change constantly, or as political situations change, sometimes the retention of talent is not as high as it could be. The second thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that commercializing research that comes from the universities is something that has been a barrier. There's not that much university research that gets commercialized compared to a top ecosystems like Tel Aviv or Silicon Valley, because of some of the historical barriers that are in place that are being worked to be dismantled. One of the things that's kind of a weak spot of the ecosystem is the level of global connectedness. Of course, global connectedness is very important for companies when they scale, and the companies here do think globally very early. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a network within the countries that they're scaling to. And part of that is because in a high trust society, your personal network might be very, very small in comparison to a place like Silicon Valley, where you have a much, much larger personal network. So that's something that is more of a weak point when it comes to local entrepreneurs. Marketing savvy is a general weakness. You'll see a lot of really, really high-tech companies here with a team of, all PhDs that are purely technical, and maybe an intern that's working on marketing as an afterthought. This leads to a lot of the companies maybe being underpriced, maybe not always reaching the right investors, and maybe scaling at a much smaller level than they could had they had the marketing savvy. So it's definitely something that the ecosystem needs more of, which is good marketing and PR understanding. Of course, I mentioned previously there's a funding gap at the post-Series A, so this is not a place to come and raise a huge round. That's the ecosystem where you might come and build the company, but you would need to talk to the investors in a different ecosystem. And then finally, I'll end with a European-wide problem, which is that scaling in Europe itself is difficult, as each country kind of has its own challenges. So the vast, vast majority of Nordic unicorns succeed because they went to the US and scaled there first. So they might have gone on a path where they scaled to the Nordics and then maybe Germany or the UK, but generally they looked at the US very, very early. So you don't see like a European-wide unicorn, but more like a Nordic to US unicorn. And then finally, for the companies that are listening and are looking and thinking they still would like to join the Nordics and maybe grow a company from there, I'll talk a little bit about the market entry conditions. So first of all, I mentioned it's a super high trust environment, and that means that if you're used to doing business through cold outreach, like you might see in an ecosystem like Tel Aviv or an ecosystem like New York, it's not really going to work very well. People are probably going to ignore you, especially if you don't have a Nordic address or a Nordic presence already. So for companies that are coming in from outside of Europe especially, it's very, very important that you try to get warm introductions. And that's why market entry services like Copenhagen Capacity that make these types of introductions are super, super important to starting on the right foot. We usually recommend that you try to visit the ecosystem first and kind of learn a little bit about it and get the nuances. The two biggest tech events for startups are Slush, which is happening December 1st and 2nd in Helsinki, Finland, and Tech Barbecue, which happens in the fall. And those are places where you can come as a startup and meet the ecosystem and kind of see if you can get good partner talks going before you land here. So that's kind of one way that you can breach the high trust environment is actually just by going to a local tech event. Very straightforward advice that a lot of companies like to ignore. There's a lot of inward investment agencies that have startup know-how, and their services are free. So not just us, but all of the other Nordics actually have these agencies. I know that when it comes to the public sector, a lot of companies are kind of wary about talking to them, but I would say the public sector in the Nordics generally has a higher level of startup know-how than a lot of other regions. A lot of times someone has come from a startup themselves that works there. So don't be afraid to reach out to them. They might know the ecosystem very, very well. And in a small city, they probably know the people that you actually need to meet. Immigration, if you're from outside the EU, can be very, very difficult. So it's important to research if you can actually get a startup visa. The startup visa programs exist in all the Nordic countries, but they have different criteria. So it's really important to first see if your startup can actually meet the criteria and get the visa to come. If you can't get that visa, or you do get the visa, but you're still not sure where to go, you should definitely look for the incubator or accelerator programs in your sector. And see what works best for you. So for some of the strength areas that I pointed out, there's many, many accelerator programs. If you're within health tech, if you're in sustainability, if you're in urban tech, there's an incubator for you in the Nordics that you should consider reaching out to. Finally, I'll say that all of these startups ecosystems actually have online databases where you can kind of learn about who all the investors are, who all the startups are, who all the accelerators, incubators are, and who the players are. Some of them are funded by Dealroom, and some of them are by local companies. So there's actually a high level of transparency when it comes to learning. So I would say you can also check out what you're looking for here. It's a one-stop shop. And I'll end there. I know that Danil is also a little bit sick today, so hopefully this is not his longest event. And I think we can start with some questions, if there are any.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was very informative. I really liked the way you structure it. So I think people can apply this information, especially in terms of market research and some trends. It's valuable information. It's usually really hard to find. We have some questions. We actually have right now one question, and everyone who is watching us right now, please feel free to ask questions while we are live. We have one question related to what you just discussed. We have a question from Anna Pavlova. What are the main steps to open the company, bank account, and operate legally, in your opinion?
I mean, Anna, this is not a one stop, like one size fits all question, because it depends on the country that you're looking to land in, and it depends on the country that you're coming from. So I'll assume if you're coming from Russia, for example, first you would have to see if you could get a startup visa to open the company, because you're non-EU. So the first thing to do would be to research the startup visa programs and see if you can get the visa. If you can get the visa, the next stop would be talking to an inward investment agency like us at Copenhagen Capacity, and seeing how you can register the company and get a bank account. That part is actually very easy, but the most difficult part, if you're non-EU, would be looking to see if you can actually get a visa to open the company.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you gotta find your strategic partner in there, so that will guide you through and basically support you um, with taking first steps and giving you some interest. That's what you mentioned.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, thank you. What is Copenhagen Capacity, and what you guys are doing? So maybe our audience might be also interested in your services. So you feel free to mention what you are up to.
I mean, what we're up to is it's an inward investment agency. So that means that if your company is considering moving here and you're not sure, you just give us a call. It's free of charge, and we will see if we can help you, or if it's even a good idea. I mean, we're not selling you Copenhagen. We're seeing if it's a good fit for your company. And if it's not, maybe we'll send you to some place that's a better fit. I can see there's a couple
Yeah, a
coming
few
in
more
here.
questions. Yeah, there is one from Natalia. Lisa, thank you for the introduction to the topic. Can you please point out some of the differences in the approaches of ESG among different regions?
I think I wouldn't say there's different approaches in SDGs and ESGs in the sense that they're all considered. Are you asking about the approach when it comes to venture capital or when it comes to the public sector?
Let me actually read all the questions she asked. Maybe she clarified. So the other question: are there any EU specific specifics that are pioneer to the world that we have to catch up with? Okay. She wants to name one or two. Okay.
I'm actually not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Natalia, can you clarify your question? We don't understand your question. Maybe she will. Actually, ESG now is a big topic in many regions. I completely agree with you. I have partners in Australia. They are up to going after ESG. In Moscow, there are specific funds just recently created just to invest in sustainability. And Europe was far already quite a long time in this. I'm glad that you mentioned this, and so I a little bit consider our community as that is taking an impact on entrepreneurship, because we believe that everyone should have equal and free access to basic knowledge of how to start international companies. We don't believe borders exist, and that's why we're creating this stuff. Natalia, do you have clarification of the question, because we don't understand the question? So maybe you can take it as you understand it. She wants the differences, different approaches of doing ESG among different regions. So maybe difference by country, how to do ESG projects in there, if you have any idea about that.
I mean, it really depends on what the public sector is primarily looking at, I guess, if you're looking at it from the public sector perspective. So if you're a startup and you're saying, okay, I have an ESG company and we're focusing on climate, what's the specifics? Is it an energy company? Are you looking to work with wind, or are you looking to work with something like we lessen the amount of ambulance rides people need, and therefore it has a green impact, so we're looking to work with the healthcare sector? I mean, you have to kind of find what your specific ESG path is. And generally, because ESG is so broad, that would fall underneath a strength sector that's in a specific country. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. She's currently typing her clarification. What are the usual way of? So you are. I guess that since you mentioned United States, I guess the startups that are international, that are coming to the Nordics, if they are outside you, they already probably have some business operating in the US. It's like they usually expand. Is it a correct way to put it like that?
I'm sorry. So you're saying if the Nordics?
They start global startups start their business wherever part in the world,
Yes.
and they I recommend those startups to start with the US, just because it's one of the largest markets for the startups, along with China. So do you witness startups that are coming to the Nordics that are already coming from the United States? They already have some presence in the United States.
Sure. I mean, if you're a startup, you shouldn't necessarily be looking at largest market when you're looking at where to scale, because that's not the only variable. The most important variable is what is the correct framework from which to scale from. You'll see a lot of really, really successful startups that are scaling from Copenhagen or Estonia or very, very small markets. But why are they basing their HQ there, Luxembourg? It's because it is the best legal framework for the type of company they're making, and it's a location that allows them to scale globally. So the subsidiary might be in the US, but the main research or R&D or HQ is actually located in a much smaller market that has a much better legal framework or conditions that make it easier for that company to grow.
Yeah, thank you. So Natalia clarified her question. Maybe now we can understand it. So Europe, in my opinion, is very dedicated to sustainability. I want to ask if there are some new practices or approaches to companies' compliance. And she also adds, are there any specific requirements for a startup?
I'm not really sure what you mean by requirements, but I would say one of the difficult things with SDGs and ESGs is that there's not a universal way to measure them. So especially when it comes to like impact VCs, they're each doing their own types of due diligence, not even necessarily sharing with each other or being fully transparent about what they consider is a high impact startup. But they actually consider that the work must be done initially by the company. So that means that you have to look at your carbon footprint yourself. You have to do that initial research and look at what is the SDG that I'm approaching, and how am I making a positive impact. And then the investor themselves will do due diligence on your research. So they actually expect the startup to do quite a bit of work before they come. So one example was you might see a company that is green because of the very nature of what they're doing. For example, they help with crowd control at public events so that there's less idling cars. But the company itself is not a green company. They're just a company that helps with crowd control. If they come to the Nordics, they should do research on how much CO2 is saved by less idling cars. The VC themselves won't look at them and say, oh, you're green because you're doing better crowd control. They want you to come with that narrative. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And all SDG companies should be, they should be profitable as expected by VCs. Is this correct?
I wouldn't say you necessarily have to be at the level that you're profit. I mean, you can definitely come at an early stage and say that you have not found full product market fit, but you've only just tested your MVP. That's fine.
Okay.
Especially if you're looking to work with a city pilot, then maybe it wasn't possible for you to test in your home city, right? you're looking to do a pilot partnership with a city that's specifically looking for a green initiative. Maybe your home city is not.
Yeah. All right. So I will take this opportunity to maybe close the session and take some rest because I'm a little bit sick. I'm really, really grateful for your time and that we finally made this talk. I think it was amazing, and the information we received is the great quality. So I'm hoping that the audience who registered for this webinar get as much value as they expected and build their businesses with all those recommendations. But before you go, what would be your final statement to the audience, your maybe recommendation, something from your heart? It doesn't have to be something formal, it might be informal, wherever, but this is what you might want the audience to be left with.
Oh no, that's such a big question. Now I feel like all the pressure's on me. I mean, I would like to talk on the theme, but I would say if you're looking at the Nordic startup ecosystem, there's very good reasons to come here if you're a green startup, but also if you're just someone that's looking for maybe a better place to live with your family. Sometimes it's not always about coming for the investment or coming because you'll have the right market fit. It's just a nice place to live.
Very great. Thank you so much. It was Lisa Mallner, and she was delivering a talk about Nordic startup ecosystem. Thank you, everyone, and have